Good morning. Welcome to Scientist to Go. My name is Aowen, and we are going to be doing a 25-minute presentation first from Aaron, and then we're going to do a 15-minute question and answer session. So please make sure that you're adding those questions into the chat. As soon as they pop in your head, you can add them, and then I will save them all to the end, and I'll read them out to Aaron so we can make sure we answer all of your questions. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on over to Aaron to introduce himself.
Thank you. Great to be here this morning, and hope everyone is doing well, especially after our Arctic blast. Especially all the chat items and things people like outdoors. That's great. Probably except for sailing, most of that happens in the forest if you're here in Maine. So I'm really excited to talk about the work that I do and the importance of forest both within Maine and outside of Maine. I'm at the University of Maine. I'm in the School of Forest Resources. So it's where we teach forestry classes and work with students. I also run the Center for Research on Sustainable Forest, which is focused on a lot of building collaborations both inside and outside of Maine to kind of support and understand the forest. Just some background on myself. So I originally grew up in Ohio. You might be amazed, but despite all the cornfields that are in Ohio, we actually do have a lot of forest. And of course, I'm a Buckeye. So I went to Ohio State University. I had a forestry degree there. And then I went, like most of the people from Ohio, at some point went west. So I went to Oregon, another heavily forested state. I was a beaver who likes to also live in the forest. So I went and did my Master's of Science and my doctorate at Oregon State University. After that, I worked for a very large forest land-owned company, Weyerhaeuser. They actually own about 1 million acres here in Maine in the last couple of years, but started out in the Pacific Northwest. For them, I did a lot of research and science to help them increase their productivity of their forest. In 2008, I moved east. I actually have an aunt and uncle who moved to Maine in the early 1980s and lived on the coast in Surrey. So I actually came to Maine as a child, but Maine, I've been here since 2008, and it's been a real pleasure to be here in Maine. What I want to talk about today is just forest and how Maine's forest is relatively unique, but fits within the importance of forest. So I'll try to keep this interactive. Does anyone know how much percent area forests currently cover in the United States?
You can post any guesses you have in the chat. Okay, I see one person guessed maybe 80%, 42.
All right. Getting closer with 42.
63.
Yeah.
60.
All right. So the probably closer at some point, forests were probably maybe 60 to 70% of the total United States. But if anyone spent time in kind of the central part of the plain states, they were mostly grasslands. If we look at this map here, we're blessed in New England in that we're heavily forested, and we'll talk about that. Forest has been a large part of our history and cultural heritage for a long time, but I just wanted to give you a perspective for forest throughout the United States. The amount of diversity of forest that happens in the United States is unparalleled in a lot of other places in the world. We have highly diverse forests, and some might argue that is one reason that the United States has kind of become the country it has, because of this bountiful natural resource. So just to put some things in context, so Ohio is considered part of the central hardwood forest. These tend to be very rich soils, lots of diversity of tree species. Most of the tree species, as we talk about tree species, we talk about deciduous, or often what we call hardwood species. These are things like oak, maple, birch. So a lot of high diversity here in the central hardwood region. We have this finger of the forest that goes through the Appalachian Mountains. This is part of what's called the Northern Forest. The Northern Forest does extend up into Canada. And then we transition from the Northern Forest into the boreal, which is kind of what you can think of as Alaska or northern parts of Canada. These southern plains that kind of follow along the Atlantic Ocean are what we call the southern forest. These tend to be dominated by oaks as well as pine species. Both species are very dependent on fire, so they tend to regenerate best under fire systems. So those are the three primary forest types in the eastern half of the US. If you venture across into the western area, of course, what you pick up are a lot of the Rocky Mountains, which dominates the conifer the dry and kind of colder mountains of the Rockies. You get more conifer dominated forest. So these are things like ponderosa pine, pitch pine, lodgepole pine. Again, these are very well adapted to fire. Fire is a big part of how forests respond to natural disturbances. Usually they're caused by lightning, as they tend to be dry. Where I was in the Pacific Northwest, we have very wet winters, which is why some of the reasons that we have some of the tallest trees in the world that grow along the Pacific coast. So two of the most common species that you'll hear there are Douglas fir and coast redwood, if anyone's had a chance. Coast redwood is the famous tree that you can drive through if you ever venture to California. So really, we're talking about 5 forest types that differ a lot in terms of the species that are present. Now, if we zoom into Maine, this is a picture of Maine's forest types, as well as we are unique in that we have 7 distinct climatic zones that really overlap with our forest. Most of it is dominated by our proximity to the Atlantic Ocean and how we receive our climate. We kind of stick out into the ocean. Also, this grayed on area, remember, is our Canadian colleagues, New Brunswick to the east, and then Quebec and parts of New Brunswick to the north. Similar forest type as we saw in the previous map, but we are what's called a transitional forest. As you see, the colors here go from the blue, which is kind of the northern end of that temperate forest where hardwoods like oak and maple dominate, right around Bangor, kind of the center of the state. We see this transition. So many of you might have driven up I-95 past Bangor or Arnold, the University of Maine. And we see this quick transition of our forest type as we go a lot more to this yellow type, which is our spruce fir. So this is important about Maine, as it's a transitional ecosystem. So as we think about natural disturbances and climate change, our forest is kind of somewhat vulnerable because species are either at the southern end of their limit, so the southern end of the limit for the boreal forest. Also, some of these temperate trees are at the northern extent of their range. And so you have a lot of species overlap that occurs in Maine and is controlled by our climatic features. So I want to highlight softwoods and hardwoods. Does anyone know some of our most common softwoods? So these are our conifer dominant trees that tend to keep their leaves during the winter time.
You can post your guesses in the chat. Pine.
Yep, so that's one of our major softwood trees, actually our state tree, right? So eastern white pine. This is what you often see sticking above the forest, as they tend to be some of our taller trees, often reaching up to 100 to 120 feet in height. A lot of Maine's history is tied back to eastern white pine. If you remember, they were called the king's pine. Basically, the king of England claimed them for their ships and were then using them to make their mast of the ship. So a very important tree in terms of Maine's history. One of the reasons it's our state tree. Other guesses on softwood trees?
We have firs, spruce, jack fir, white oak, spruce, red pine, and hemlock.
Oh, wow. Great guesses. Yep. So the other top two trees that are in Maine's environment that are also important, as we talked about, is spruce and balsam fir. So spruce fir is one of that yellow common forest type up in northern Maine. They like very cool summers. They like it to be moist, and they can grow in a variety of conditions, um, tending to be a little more wet than eastern white pine. Eastern white pine likes it relatively dry, and tends to be on kind of what we consider upland conditions where its roots don't get wet. Spruce is unique. We have several spruce species in Maine. Red, black, white are the most common types. They occur in different parts of the landscape. Red is probably the most common. Black tends to be in higher elevations, maybe somewhat wetter sites, and then white kind of covers everything in between. When we think about Christmas trees and Christmas wreaths and the smells that those have, those are often related to the balsam fir tree. So balsam fir is one of our most common softwoods. It often occurs in conjunction with spruce. That's why we call it the spruce fir forest type. A really unique species. One downside to balsam fir is it's very vulnerable to the spruce budworm. So even though we call it the spruce budworm, the budworm actually prefers balsam fir. And that's one of the challenges that we face with Maine's current forest. All right, so I gave away an answer here. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. But one of the most important hardwood species, so hardwoods are those that tend to lose their leaves during the wintertime. They also generate products such as maple sugar for the sugar maple. They also are used for a variety of different purposes than the softwoods. So we have sugar maple. These tend to be the bright orange color in the fall. Many people now are thinking about tapping these sugar maples in the February and March to catch the sap that runs through them. Do people know other potential hardwood species?
The other guess we have is oak.
Yep. So oak, red, white swamp oak. These tend to have a little bit darker purple red foliage. Red oak is probably the more common in southern Maine. It often grows in conjunction with eastern white pine. Very good firewood for those that have wood stoves. Lots of nice properties. They produce acorns, which wildlife species really like and benefit from. Another very common species is also our birch species. Just like spruce, there's a variety of birches: paper, yellow, and black. So again, we have a diversity of tree species. These species occur throughout Maine, but we tend to have this general pattern that's related to the species characteristics. In the southern part of the state, tends to be more hardwoods. It's a little bit drier, a little bit warmer temperatures in the summer months. Whereas we move north, we get longer winters, colder temperatures, both during the summer and the winter. And we generally have what are considered poorly drained soils, or as we think about bogs or other kind of very wet conditions, these are much more preferred by our spruce and balsam fir species. So Maine is really quite unique in terms of its forest and its diversity. Also, I want to be sure to mention, does anyone know what percent forest cover in Maine?
I have a guess of 90%. Another one,
Yep.
88, 80.
All right, so yeah, 89.9% is the forest. So very good guesses. It is actually the U.S. state that has the most percent forested in the entire U.S. So about 17 million acres, 89%. If we got rid of all these big lakes that we have, it'd be about 94 to 95% of our land area. So as I said at the beginning, if you're doing outdoor activities, more than likely you're doing those in the forest. And that's really unique to Maine, and something that I think people really benefit and respond to. Now, I want to talk about some of the challenges and the things that we research in terms of science. As you might have heard, some of the big drivers that I alluded to: climate change. So we know, as we can see with our winters, they're getting kind of shorter. more variable temperatures. I saw on Thursday we're going to be 50 degrees. So it's pretty remarkable to go from a -50 wind chill to 50 degrees all within a week. So we also know that precipitation might become variable. If you might have recalled, our last few summers have been relatively dry. So trees generally grow throughout the summer season, and so they don't have the moisture they need. That's a challenge. Decarbonization is just a fancy term for basically using less fossil fuels. As you might have heard, Governor Mills has a bold goal of trying to become carbon neutral. So that means that Maine as a state does not emit any carbon more than what we capture, either through a variety of mechanisms, and we can talk about that. The forest is one big reason of how Maine can kind of contain its or reduce its carbon footprint. We have a lot of state and federal policy. We've had a lot of land ownership changes. So Maine, not only being the most forested state in the US, it is highly privately owned by a variety of individuals. Well over 92% of the forest is owned by private individuals. So that's also unique and very different to the Western US, which are primarily owned by the US Forest Service or our federal government. We know that rural economies have changed, and we've heard that in the news recently. So we've heard about the J mill exploding. We've heard about mills in Millinocket closing. This is a big shift. Paper was a primary product for a long time of Maine's history. There's lots of reasons for these closures, but it definitely changes how we think about Maine's forest and the jobs that it supports. Now, as we think about society, a lot of people are talking about carbon offset programs or carbon markets. So you might have talked about that. There's also been talk of natural climate solutions. So how do we use things like natural resources like our ocean and forest to address climate change? We have a diversity of landowners. We have new policies. And some of the future opportunities as we think about is emerging technology. So some of you might have heard about AI, artificial intelligence. A lot of what we do in the research center is looking at satellites. So this is really a game changer for how we think about forest. There's also a lot of interest, I think, in green collar careers. So forestry is a very broad field that has a lot of different components. Some of you might have heard the exciting news that GoLab is now open and has reopened the Madison Mill. So a paper mill that once closed, lied dormant for several years and now is reopened. In the past fall, they are producing a very unique product. Actually, they are building insulation for homes based on wood fiber. So this is a very unique, I think one of the first in North America, happening here in Maine. So that's very exciting. As I mentioned here, one of the governor's objectives by 2045 was to become carbon neutral. So that means that carbon as a state, or Maine as a state, will sequester or offset any carbon that we emit through driving cars or burning fossil fuels. And our forest is a large reason that we are able to offset a lot of carbon. Right now, Maine offsets about 60 to 75% of the state's emissions. So just by having lots of trees, few people, the trees capture the carbon and have helped us already achieve a pretty high carbon neutrality, which is we got to think about as we think about policy and markets as we go forward. As I already mentioned as well, a lot of harvesting of forest for paper or saw logs happens in the winter. And so as our winters have warmed, we don't have the frozen ground, we have less snow cover. This actually makes it tougher for loggers to do their jobs. And so this has been a changing dynamic as we think about our climate change. So lots of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges. So now I just want to highlight what we do here at the University of Maine and what my job is. If you'd like to learn more information, it's at the center, crsfumaine.edu. The way that we like to say what we do is we do the tools, the technology, and the science for tomorrow's forest. We do that through research, and a lot of my focus is on that. We also do education, so teaching forestry classes and working with all of you. We also do a lot of communications and outreach. So I just want to highlight some of the work that we do and why it's relatively unique. So in terms of research, one of the important things is a place up north of Bangor called the Howland Research Forest. It is a long-term site, and about 30 years ago, they put this tower up in the forest. Does anybody know why they might put a tower up in the forest? All right.
Anybody want to add any guesses to the chat? Ooh, to spot fires? So they can see more of the forest? Maybe it's a cell tower?
Well, all good guesses.
Ooh,
So,
and record wind speed.
all right. Okay. So the last one was probably the closest. So that, yes, some of you are familiar with fire towers. They were very present in the 1930s and 1940s. You can still climb several of those in Maine, but they're much more common in the Western US, where fire is a lot more common and a bigger issue. Good observation on seeing forests. It's amazing once you get above. I think many of you have been on an airplane and just seen how many forests cover the Maine landscape. Actually, as someone guessed, to measure wind speed, that's what all these sensors are hanging off of the tower. So this tower sits above the forest and it basically watches the forest breathe. So as we know, trees take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. So as we watch the flow of these uh, molecules, we can also track how the forest is growing and doing. A lot of that gets bound to the carbon, and so we can watch the carbon exchange. The carbon comes from the atmosphere, is upticked by the trees, and then they release oxygen, and we can measure that year to year, day to day, week to week. And so this site is very important because it allows us to watch the forest in very close detail, which help us develop a very detailed carbon budget for the state of Maine. And that's how we came up with forest offsetting 60 to 75% of our current greenhouse gas emissions. Another exciting thing that we do is what we call satellites, sensors, satellites, and surveys. So many of you might have gotten a UAV and kind of a self-flying drone, as some people like to call them. These are a really big deal for us because they allow us to see the forest in much greater detail than we've ever been able to measure before. Traditionally, what we do to measure the forest is we go out and measure individual trees. Obviously, we have 17 million acres of forest in Maine. We're not going to be able to measure every single tree. So what satellites like these UAVs offer us is the ability to look at the forest in 3 dimensions, and we use that using cutting edge remote sensing technology. So this allows us to zoom in and out of the forest without actually ever having to walk through the forest. And so this is really exciting. That allows us to detect pests like the emerald ash borer or spruce bedworm. It also allows us to measure carbon at a much higher resolution than what we traditionally would do. So this is very exciting and kind of the future of what we're trying to strive for at the University of Maine. The other exciting thing that we do is outreach. So as many of you know, Maine's forest is privately owned, and these individuals own it for a variety of reasons. Some might be just for the land value, some might be for the timber value, others might be for the wildlife habitat it provides, or others might be just entirely for the timber. And so a large part of my job is working directly with foresters on a regular basis to help them deal with a variety of issues. So some of those issues, as we talked about, is how do we use remote sensing technology for them to make better decisions? What is the value of these forests in terms of carbon or traditional forest products like paper or lumber? How do they assess wildlife habitat? So what is this particular forest good for? Is it good for deer, moose, snowshoe hare? All the species that we know that live and use the forest, we try to help the managers understand and make the best management decision that they can. So my job is very diverse. It's very exciting to work directly with a variety of people and a lot of other scientists, and I think really important work that helps move the state forward. So was a quick overview of Maine's forest and some of the responsibilities I did. Hopefully I've left plenty of time for your questions, and I'm happy to answer anything that might have come up. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And we do have a few questions. So kind of going back earlier in your presentation, you had mentioned the difference between softwoods and hardwoods, and you had 3 examples of each. For the hardwoods and the softwoods, which one is most used?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, it depends on what species we're talking about. So let me back up here, see if I can go backwards. Oh, I didn't, but I'll just answer the question. So the 3 species that I had were eastern white pine, spruce, fir were the softwoods. Softwoods tend to be primarily used for lumber. So when we think about lumber, those are the 2x4s that you buy at Home Depot or Lowe's. These are usually used for construction. So if you see a new house being built, that's usually with white pine, spruce, or fir. Eastern white pine is probably our most valuable species. People that have eastern white pine can sell it for what we consider a board foot. So that's about $550 per board foot, where spruce fir are about 300 to 350 per 1,000 board feet. So they don't tend to be as valuable because they do tend to grow a little bit faster and larger than our hardwood species. Hardwood species have a different type of wood structure. They have a bit more kind of diversity of species, obviously, as we talked about maple, birch, oak, a lot of different species. These tend to be used for very specialty products. So I can give you a few examples. A lot of our furniture is made with maple or oak, as they have nice designs. You'll hear about oak furniture. There's also a variety of other uses that you would never think of. So like the popsicle sticks are often made with birch. A lot of golf tees were originally made with birch. Oak, we don't have a lot of white oak, but a lot of the wine or other kind of alcohols are aged in oak barrels. So these tend to have very different uses. Obviously, a big use of sugar maple is maple syrup. You can actually get syrup from all species. You can have birch syrup, you can have maple syrup. Obviously, sugar maple got its name because it has some of the highest sugar content. So that is the reason that we tend to prefer sugar maple.
Okay. What kind of jobs can you get with after you take forestry classes at UMaine?
Yeah, that's a great question. We offer 3 degrees within the School of Forest Resources. These 3 degrees are traditional forestry. So forestry degrees, you tend to be working outdoors. You can work for a variety of different landowners. A lot of this work as a forester involves going out and measuring the forest. So that's a big part of a forester's job, is just seeing how the trees are doing, seeing how they're growing. If you're working for a commercial landowner like Weyerhaeuser, Wagner Forest Management, Seven Islands, some of our larger landowners, you'd probably be doing some harvest layout. So you would go out and look for a certain forest condition, walk the boundaries, mark the boundaries, work with a contractor who might be doing the harvesting to make sure that you get the harvest done as you might like. Other people work for state agencies or conservation organizations. Again, these are kind of looking at the health of the forest and the overall kind of just the nature of forest, and working with either recreation people or other people who use the forest. 2 other degrees that we have at the University of Maine. One is on conservation and recreation. So a lot, some of you might know, Maine has law enforcement agents that work in the forest to look at either wildlife or protection of public lands. And so those tend to be people that have recreation or conservation science degrees. So you learn about the forest, but also you learn about the policy and some of the recreational policies. So think about Maine's kind of large destinations like Acadia, Baxter State Park, Sugarloaf, Saddleback this time of year. A lot of those people have recreation staff to help people navigate and understand some of those issues that come up when you have a lot of people using the forest. The final degree that we offer is what's called a wood science degree. And so people here learn about how do you make paper, how do you make new technology using wood fiber. So there's a lot of interest right now in what's called cellulosic nanofibers. These are the little itty bits of trees that people can use in a variety of fashions. So as I mentioned, the Madison lab is using cellulosic nanofiber to make insulation. So no longer are we using kind of human-made products. We have basically insulation made from trees effectively, and that there's a lot of different applications for this technology. And Maine is a national and international leader in terms of the production of cellulosic nanofibers. So I think you will hear a lot more about that as we go forward. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, especially as we think about carbon, wildlife, biodiversity. Forestry is a really unique degree. If you like to be outdoors, as we started the session with, it is a great way to see lots of great places. And as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, Maine isn't the only place that has forest. So in my career, I've been able to obviously travel to Oregon, southern US. I've also been able to go international. Lots of forests are in Chile and South America, in Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, Finland. I've been to New Zealand. So forest is a great way to travel and see the world if that's what you'd like to do.
Awesome. Did you always know you wanted to work in forestry?
Yeah, well, I would say I grew up in Ohio, so forests there are not as abundant as Maine. But I was lucky to have parents who really liked camping and national parks. And so we traveled around the US and I got to see lots of different places. And so I always knew I wanted to do a career in the outdoors. And I suddenly found forestry. So it was very fortunate that I did. It's been a very great career. So not only can I now enjoy the forest either through skiing or hiking, I also get to work in the forest, which is really fun. And you get to work with a variety of different people. As I said, the forest has people that the loggers, the foresters, people that own the land, people that want to sell carbon or other diversity. It's a really neat and evolving profession that I feel really passionate about, and I wish more people knew about. I think there's a lot of career opportunities, especially as we think about future opportunities in the whole realm of natural resources and green economies.
Okay. I have a question about, you'd mentioned wildlife earlier, and you'd said that wildlife are affected. So how are the different types of animals affected by the tree types that are in a forest?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great question. So the forest is home to a lot of species. Also, one of the reasons that Maine probably has fairly clean waters, I know people mention fishing, is because we have a lot of forest. So the forest keep the soil from eroding and going into our streams and ponds, which cause challenges for the aquatic life. So forests are really important for not only kind of our terrestrial animals, but our aquatic animals. So it's important to make that connection. As I mentioned, Maine's forest changes, oak, pine, oak, pine in the southern part of the state. So a lot of species rely on the acorns from the oak. Commonly, there are a lot of bird species, deer, obviously, like acorns. So the more acorns, probably the more wildlife species, and then the whole kind of wildlife chain follows. Up north in our spruce fir forest type, you might have heard of things like Canadian lynx, snowshoe hare, moose. These tend to be our more northern species. They tend to rely much more on colder conditions, just like spruce fir rely on. So it's this kind of dynamic interaction between the forest and also kind of the species that are present. So one example is that especially during the winter months, deer don't like to be under hardwood cover. So they like to be protected by our softwoods that retain the needle, that kind of protect them from days where it's -50 or other snowing and conditions. And so you'll hear a lot about softwood or conifer areas where deer will tend to migrate. So again, a variety of habitats. That's what we talk about. Maine is unique in that we have a diversity of species, a diversity of forest types, and we also have a diversity of wildlife species that rely on that forest.
Oh, cool. I have a two-part question about deforestation. So is Maine experiencing severe deforestation? And then the other part of it is whenever there is like clear cutting of an area of a forest, maybe for lumber or something, why is it being replenished with one species rather than a diversity of species of trees?
Yep. So two excellent questions. These are terms that often get thrown out and are confusing for a lot of people. So deforestation is something that we often associate with the tropical forest in Brazil or other parts of probably the Midwest. This is when forest gets converted permanently to non-forest uses. So the biggest threat to forest aren't necessarily the wildlife or wildfires, it's humans. So humans like to develop subdivisions or metropolitan areas. And so that's where deforestation is happening. Maine, even though we have had some population growth, it's a lot of it is in southern Maine, where the forests have already been cleared for agricultural reasons to begin with, and so deforestation doesn't really occur that much here in Maine. So deforestation is much more an issue when lands get converted like to subdivisions in the Midwest or to agricultural settings like in the tropical forest. So it's important to distinguish between deforestation and non-deforestation. So deforestation is not that big of a deal here in Maine. Another big issue is afforestation. This is when land becomes forest. So a lot of, as we talked about earlier on in Maine's history, or places like Massachusetts. Massachusetts was nearly all forested that was cleared, used for agriculture, and has now been allowed to revert back to forest. So that's what we consider afforestation, as forest coming back onto areas that were previously forested. What happens a lot in Maine is forest harvesting. So this is different than deforestation. Even though the trees are removed, the forest is allowed to come back over time. Now there's controversy in forest harvesting that we could talk about. So one term that someone mentioned was clear cutting. Clear cutting is a practice that is used in forestry. It's when all the overstory trees are removed, and that could be for a variety of reasons. They could all be unhealthy. They could be like emerald ash, borer, and they need to be removed for health reasons. Another common reason is to create early successional habitat. So certain species like deer or snowshoe hare actually prefer young regenerating stands. And so those often happen in clear cutting. The majority of harvesting that happens in Maine is what's considered partial harvesting. So there, about 40 to 60% of the canopy is removed. So very different than a clear cut where 100% of the canopy is removed. In the partial harvest, trees are allowed to grow up depending on the shade conditions. So trees have different requirements for light and moisture. And so with a partial harvest, certain trees are favored because they can grow up in a moist, semi-shaded environment. The final question on clear cut and planting. So planting is very common in the southern US and western US. Less than 1,000 acres per year in Maine are actually planted. Those tend to be spruce plantations up in the northern Maine area. Those are actually some of the fastest growing and most carbon friendly practices. And that's one way that Maine could achieve carbon neutrality, is relying more on single species plantations, which will allow a larger portion of the forest to remain forested and not in plantations. But obviously a very challenging and something that people don't always feel comfortable with, but great questions.
Yeah, I have one more student question before we have my final two closing questions. We also have a question about hemlock woolly adelgid that has been covered in their curriculum earlier this year. And so they were wondering how big of a problem is hemlock woolly adelgid in Maine and what is being done to address it?
Yeah, great question. So I spent a summer at Harvard Forest in Massachusetts when I was an undergrad at Ohio State, and the thing I focused on there was hemlock woolly adelgid. So obviously, hemlock woolly adelgid has been around a long time. It was imported, our nursery stock from China, and has kind of made its way slowly north. Hemlock is probably one is a species I didn't mention, but it's within the top 5 of softwood species in Maine. So a very important species that tends to grow along our wet areas like streams or lakes. So if you're in a heavily shaded area, you're generally in hemlock. Hemlock has been noted to occur in southern Maine. I think Cape Elizabeth around Portland was one of the first areas it was noted. It tends to cause a white kind of substance on the bottom of the foliage, and eventually it kills all the needles in the tree. Tree dies suddenly after. So it's a big issue and it's a big threat given how common hemlock is present. Not much can be done with it. If you have a single hemlock, it can be sprayed every year, but that's very expensive and obviously doesn't work well for forest. So the most important thing right now is just limiting the spread of hemlock. And also, even though we might not like the -20 temperatures that we just had, this is actually important for limiting the northward migration of the hemlock woolly adelgid. It usually takes about 5 to 7 days of -20 temperatures to kill the hemlock woolly adelgid. So that's one of the issues with our changing winters is it allows species like emerald ash borer or hemlock woolly adelgid to actually move north when our temperatures are warmer than what they probably should be.
Okay, thank you. And so it looks like we're actually over time, so I'm just gonna ask really quickly, what is your favorite part of your job?
My favorite part of the job is that when I want to go outside, if I got a nice sunny day, I can head out to the forest and meet with people. If it's a rainy, cold, snowy day and not much fun to be outdoors, I can spend it working on stuff in front of a computer. I think it's the diversity, and I feel like forests are so important to Maine that better understanding them and helping people to understand them are very important. So I'm passionate about forests as both a scientist as well as an individual who enjoys recreating in forest. I think the other point that I brought up is it's just allowed me to travel the world. I've got to go to a lot of cool places, see really unique things. And if you like the outdoors, you like trees, I think forestry is an opportunity for you to consider. So that's great.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I'm gonna stop our recording now.